I'm Margaret Rose, 94 years old, and for the past decade, my own grandchildren have whispered behind my back, calling me the bitter old lady who lives alone in that tiny, shabby house on Maple Street. At last Sunday's family dinner, my grandson Jake rolled his eyes when I offered to help with his college tuition. "Grandma, you can barely afford your own groceries," he laughed, while his sister Emma nodded in agreement. What they didn't know was that hidden in the basement of my shabby house were documents proving I'd built a $47 million manufacturing empire from nothing after World War II. Took my beloved husband Thomas. Tomorrow, I would gather them all and reveal how their poor, bitter grandmother had secretly been funding their private schools, family vacations, and mortgage payments for years. Like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by your own family. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. As I walked back to my house that evening, I could still hear Jake's condescending laughter echoing in my ears. The small white cottage on Maple Street looked exactly as it had for the past 70 years, peeling paint on the shutters, a modest front porch with 2 rocking chairs, and a garden that I tended myself despite my arthritis. To anyone passing by, it screamed of financial struggle and elderly stubbornness. Mrs. Henderson from next door waved from her window, that pitying look in her eyes that I'd grown accustomed to. She'd often bring me casseroles, convinced I couldn't afford proper groceries. "How are you managing, dear?" she'd ask, her voice dripping with concern. If only she knew that the property deed in my basement safe showed I'd purchased this house outright in 1952 for $3,200, not because it was all I could afford, but because it was perfect for my purposes. The interior was deliberately modest, furniture from the 1960s, carefully maintained but never replaced, a small television, basic appliances, and walls decorated with family photos rather than expensive art. Every choice was calculated to maintain the illusion of a widow living on a modest pension. The floorboards creaked as I made my way to the kitchen, where I kept a small notebook of household expenses, all carefully documented to show just enough financial struggle to be believable. I poured myself a cup of tea from the same ceramic pot I'd used for decades and settled into my worn armchair. Through the lace curtains, I could see the neighborhood settling into evening routines, young families hurrying children inside, professionals returning from their corporate jobs, retirees tending their gardens. None of them suspected that the poor old lady in the corner house had quietly amassed more wealth than all of them combined. The decision to live this way hadn't been easy initially. After Thomas died and my business began to flourish, there were moments when I wanted to buy a grand house, travel the world, wear expensive clothes, but I'd learned early that wealth made you a target for relatives, for con artists, for anyone who thought they deserved a piece of what you'd built. The modest house became my shield, my protection from a world that would have treated me very differently if they'd known the truth. My children, when they were young, had often complained about our poor circumstances. "Why can't we have what the other kids have?" my daughter Susan would ask. I'd explained that we had to be careful with money, that Daddy's death had left us with limited resources. It was easier than explaining that I was deliberately choosing simplicity over ostentation, that I was building something bigger than material possessions. The irony wasn't lost on me now. Those same children, now adults with children of their own, had never questioned why their private school tuitions were always mysteriously covered by scholarships, why family emergencies never seemed to create lasting financial strain, why there was always just enough money for what they truly needed. They'd grown comfortable in their assumptions about my poverty, using it as an excuse to limit their own generosity toward me. As I sat in my deliberately modest living room, surrounded by the careful theater of financial struggle I'd maintained for decades, I thought about tomorrow's family meeting. The property deed in my basement safe wasn't just a piece of paper. It was evidence of the first strategic decision I'd made in building my hidden empire. This house, this facade, this entire carefully constructed life of perceived poverty had served its purpose. But tomorrow, it would all change. That night, as I prepared for bed, my eyes fell on the framed photograph on my nightstand. Thomas in his army uniform, taken just before his deployment in 1943. His boyish grin and confident eyes still made my heart skip a beat. Even after all these years, I picked up the frame, tracing his face with my finger, remembering the whirlwind that had brought us together. I was barely 20 when I met Thomas at a USO dance in Chicago. He was on leave, handsome in his pressed uniform, with dark hair and eyes that sparkled when he laughed. While other soldiers were bold and brash, Thomas was gentle, asking politely if he could have this dance. We spent the entire evening talking about his dreams of becoming an engineer after the war, about my job at the telephone company, about the future we both hoped would come after this terrible conflict ended. "When I get back," he'd whispered in my ear as we slow danced to Glenn Miller, "I'm going to marry you, Margaret Rose Sullivan. That is, if you'll have me." I was young and naive enough to believe that love could conquer anything, even war. We married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at St. Mary's Cathedral. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and Thomas looked magnificent in his dress uniform. The reception was modest, cake and punch, in the church basement, surrounded by family and a few friends who weren't already overseas. We had 2 precious days for a honeymoon at a small inn by Lake Michigan before his leave ended. Those first months of marriage were a strange combination of bliss and terror. I moved into a tiny apartment near the base where Thomas finished his training, cherishing every moment we had together while dreading the inevitable deployment. We'd lie awake at night, planning our future, the house we'd build, the children we'd raise, the business he wanted to start. Thomas had big dreams and an innovative mind that saw solutions where others saw problems. When his orders came for the European theater, we both tried to be brave. I got a job at Consolidated Manufacturing, joining thousands of other women supporting the war effort. The work was hard, long shifts assembling munitions components, but it felt important. Like I was doing my part to bring Thomas home safely. The other women and I formed a tight bond, united by our shared sacrifice and determination. Thomas's letters came regularly at first. He wrote about the Italian countryside, about his fellow soldiers, about missing my cooking and the way I hummed while doing dishes. He never wrote about the fighting, but I could read the exhaustion and fear between the lines. His last letter, dated March 15, 1945, arrived on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "spring is coming to Italy, and the wildflowers remind me of the bouquet you carried on our wedding day. I can't say much about where we are or what we're doing, but I want you to know that thoughts of you get me through each day. When this is over, and it will be over soon, I'm coming home to build that life we've planned. Keep that beautiful smile ready for me. All my love, Thomas." 2 weeks later, the telegram arrived. I was at work, spot welding components for aircraft engines, when the plant supervisor approached with an envelope in his hand and sympathy in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Rose," he said quietly. "You need to go home." The words on that yellow paper are burned into my memory. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your husband, Sergeant Thomas Rose, was killed in action, in defense of his country on March 18, 1945, in Italy." Letter follows. I was 22 years old, married for less than 2 years, and suddenly alone in a world that was celebrating the approaching end of a war that had taken everything from me. The life we'd planned, the future we'd dreamed about, the children who would never be born, all of it died with Thomas on that Italian hillside. But as I sat in that empty apartment, holding his final letter and grieving for dreams that would never come true, something else began to grow inside me alongside the pain. It was determination, fierce, uncompromising determination to honor Thomas's memory by building something lasting, something that would prove his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. I had his innovative spirit, his belief that problems could be solved, and now I had something he'd never had, nothing left to lose. That letter, carefully preserved in my basement safe all these years, had become more than a memento. It was the foundation document of everything I'd built since, a reminder of the love that started it all and the loss that fueled my drive to succeed. After the funeral, after the condolence visits ended and the casseroles stopped coming, I found myself back at Consolidated Manufacturing. Work was the only thing that kept the crushing grief at bay. The factory floor was loud, hot, and demanding, exactly what I needed to quiet the constant ache in my chest. My supervisor, Mr. Kowalski, was a decent man who understood that keeping busy was sometimes the only way to survive loss. He assigned me to Station 7 on the assembly line, where we manufactured precision components for aircraft engines. The work required focus and attention to detail, qualities that came naturally to me, especially now that I had nowhere else to direct my energy. It was during my third week back that I first noticed the inefficiencies. The assembly line moved in rigid sequence, with each worker completing their task before passing the component to the next station. But there were constant bottlenecks at Station 12, where complex wiring had to be threaded through increasingly cramped spaces as the component took shape. Workers would often have to wait, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes, creating delays that rippled through the entire production line. During my lunch break, I walked over to observe Station 12 more closely. The problem was obvious to me. The wiring sequence was backwards. If we rerouted the main harness before installing the secondary components instead of after, workers would have 3 times more space to maneuver, cutting completion time by at least half. I mentioned this to Sarah Martinez, the woman who worked beside me at Station 8. Sarah had been at Consolidated since before the war and knew every aspect of the operation. "You're right," she said, studying the setup with experienced eyes. "But good luck getting anyone to listen. They've been doing it this way since 1941. That evening, I stayed late and sketched out my proposed modification on the back of a production schedule. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, a minor resequencing that would save significant time and reduce worker fatigue. I calculated that implementing this single change could increase daily output by nearly 20%. The next morning, I approached Mr. Kowalski with my analysis. He was a practical man, worn down by years of meeting impossible production quotas, and he studied my sketches with genuine interest. "This makes sense, Rose," he said, using my maiden name, as all the supervisors did. "Let me talk to engineering." 2 weeks later, I watched as engineers in white coats implemented my exact suggestion, testing it on a modified assembly line. The results were even better than I'd projected, a 22% increase in efficiency with noticeably less strain on the workers. The plant manager himself came down to observe the improved process. What happened next taught me my first crucial lesson about the business world in 1945. At the monthly production meeting, I watched from the factory floor as Mr. Patterson, the head of engineering, presented his innovative solution to the assembly line bottleneck. He received commendations, a bonus, and recognition in the company newsletter. My name was never mentioned. When I confronted Mr. Kowalski about this, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Margaret, you know how it is," he said quietly. "The company, board, the shareholders, they expect solutions to come from the engineering department. You'll get recognition where it counts, I promise." But I never did. Mr. Patterson was promoted to assistant plant manager within 6 months. Meanwhile, I received my original employment card as a keepsake when the temporary wartime positions ended. A small piece of cardboard that read Margaret Rose, Riveter, Station 7, hired, May 15, 1943. To most people, it represented a job that was ending as men returned from war. To me, it had become something different entirely. That employment card now sits in my basement office, framed and mounted on the wall above my desk. It reminds me of the moment I learned that having good ideas wasn't enough. You had to own them, protect them, and be willing to fight for the credit you deserved. More importantly, it taught me that if I wanted to build something lasting, in Thomas's memory, I couldn't rely on other people's fairness or recognition. The inefficiency I'd spotted wasn't unique to Station 12. Over the following months, I identified dozens of similar problems throughout the plant. But instead of sharing these observations with supervisors who would pass them off as their own innovations, I began documenting them in a notebook I kept hidden in my locker. Each inefficiency represented an opportunity, each solution a potential patent, each improvement a foundation for something bigger. I was learning to think like Thomas would have, not just as a worker following orders, but as an innovator seeing possibilities that others missed. By the winter of 1945, I had transitioned to the night shift at Consolidated. Fewer supervisors, less oversight, and more freedom to observe and experiment. The factory felt different at night, quieter, more intimate, with just the essential crew keeping production moving. It was here, in the dim lighting and relative solitude, that I made the discovery that would change everything. The night shift foreman was Eddie Kowalski, Mr. Kowalski's younger brother, who had lost his left arm at Normandy and returned to work at the plant. Eddie was different from the day shift management, practical, unpretentious, and genuinely interested in improving efficiency rather than just maintaining status quo. He noticed that I always finished my assigned tasks early and often helped other workers catch up on their quotas. "Rose, you see things others miss," he told me one November evening as we walked past the problem-plagued Station 15, where transmission components were assembled. "What do you think about this mess?" Station 15 was notorious for delays, defective parts, and worker injuries. The assembly required workers to contort themselves into uncomfortable positions to reach interior components, leading to frequent back injuries and repetitive strain. Quality control rejected nearly 15% of parts from this station, far above the plant average. I'd been watching this station for weeks, timing the movements, noting the awkward reaching and twisting required. That night, I stayed 2 hours past my shift, sketching diagrams in the margins of production manuals. The solution wasn't just about resequencing, it required completely reimagining the assembly structure. What if we built the component inside out instead of bottom up? I asked Eddie the next evening, showing him my sketches. Instead of installing the base first and then trying to reach the interior connections, we could assemble the core components first, then build the housing around them. Eddie studied my drawings with the eye of someone who understood both engineering and practical assembly. "This is brilliant, Margaret, but it would require completely new tooling, new jigs, probably new worker training." "The tooling changes are minimal," I countered, pulling out more detailed sketches I'd worked on during my lunch breaks. "Most of the existing equipment can be adapted. The jigs would need modification, but nothing revolutionary. And the worker training would actually be simpler, more natural body mechanics, less strain." Over the following weeks, Eddie and I worked together after hours, testing my concepts on discarded components. We discovered that my inside-out approach not only eliminated the ergonomic problems, but actually increased assembly speed by 40%. The component quality improved dramatically. Our test pieces showed 0 defects over 30 trials. But the real breakthrough came when I realized this principle could be applied far beyond Station 15. The inside-out assembly concept was applicable to dozens of different manufacturing processes. I began documenting every variation, every application, filling notebook after notebook with technical drawings and calculations. On a cold February morning in 1946, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. Instead of presenting my innovation to plant management, instead of trusting others to give me credit this time, I took my notebooks to the Chicago Patent Office. The patent clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked skeptical when I explained my assembly process. "Innovations, manufacturing patents are complex. Miss, are you sure you understand the technical requirements?" I spread my diagrams across his desk, detailed engineering drawings, mathematical calculations proving efficiency gains, documentation of testing, procedures and results. His expression changed as he reviewed my work. This wasn't the amateur sketch of someone with a simple idea. This was comprehensive, professional-level engineering documentation. "This is quite thorough," he admitted. "How long have you been developing this?" 8 months of observation, 4 months of testing, 2 months of documentation," I replied. "I work at Consolidated Manufacturing. I've seen these problems firsthand." Patent application number 2,847,391 was filed on February 15, 1946. With Margaret Sullivan Rose listed as sole inventor. The application described a revolutionary assembly process for complex mechanical components, with 14 specific variations and applications detailed across 12 pages of technical documentation. Dalfetti was the only person who knew what I'd done. "You realized this could change everything," he said as we worked the night shift together. "If this patent is approved, you'll own the rights to a process that could transform manufacturing." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," I replied, feeling something I hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Genuine excitement about the future. The patent application now sits in a place of honor in my basement office. The first page yellowed with age, but the technical drawings still crisp and clear. It represents more than just an innovative process. It was the moment I stopped being Margaret Rose the factory worker and became Margaret Rose the inventor, the businesswoman, the architect of an empire built on Thomas's memory and my own determination to never again let others profit from my ideas. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in April 1946. Delivered to my small apartment with the official Consolidated Manufacturing letterhead. I knew what it contained before I even opened it, but seeing the words in black and white still felt like a punch to the stomach. "Dear Mrs. Rose," it began, After careful consideration of your request for promotion to assistant floor supervisor, we regret to inform you that the position has been filled by someone with more appropriate qualifications. We appreciate your dedication during these transitional times as our workforce returns to peacetime operations. It was signed by Mr. Patterson, the same man who had taken credit for my assembly line improvement the previous year. The someone with more appropriate qualifications was Jim Morrison, a returned veteran with no factory experience, who had been hired just 6 weeks earlier. This was the third promotion I'd been denied in 8 months, despite having the highest efficiency ratings on the floor and the most innovative suggestions in the company's suggestion box. Each rejection letter used similar language: more appropriate qualifications, better suited candidate, appreciate your dedication, but corporate speak that meant one thing: no matter how qualified I was, I would never advance in a company that saw women as temporary wartime replacements. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with all 3 rejection letters spread across the table, feeling the familiar anger that had become my constant companion. But this time, something else accompanied the anger: clarity. I finally understood that I wasn't fighting individual supervisors or specific policies. I was fighting an entire system designed to keep people like me in our place. Sarah Martinez had warned me this would happen. "They'll use us as long as they need us," she'd said during one of our lunch breaks. "But when the men come home, we'll be right back where we started, secretaries and housewives. That's just how it is." But I wasn't willing to accept how it is. Thomas had died believing in a better future, and I wasn't going to honor his memory by settling for limitations other people placed on me. The patent application I'd filed was still pending, but I'd already received encouraging correspondence from the patent examiner indicating approval was likely. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Mr. Patterson. His secretary, a nervous woman named Betty who clearly felt uncomfortable delivering bad news, informed me that Mr. Patterson was very busy but could spare 5 minutes the following Thursday. Thursday came, and I arrived at Mr. Patterson's office armed with documentation, my efficiency records, innovation suggestions, and a comprehensive analysis of how my ideas had improved plant productivity by over 30% in the past year. Patterson, a heavyset man in his 50s with thinning hair and the permanent scowl of someone perpetually annoyed, barely glanced at my materials. "Mrs. Rose, I appreciate your enthusiasm," he said, the word dripping with condescension. "But you have to understand, supervisory positions require certain leadership qualities that are, frankly, more natural to men. It's not personal, it's just practical. My efficiency ratings are higher than any supervisor currently on staff," I replied calmly, though my hands were trembling with suppressed anger. "The innovations I've suggested have saved this company over $200,000 in the past year alone." "Ideas are one thing," Patterson responded, leaning back in his leather chair. "Management is another. Our shareholders expect experienced leadership, not experimental appointments." "I'm sure you understand." I understood perfectly. I understood that no amount of competence, innovation, or dedication would matter as long as men like Patterson controlled the decisions. I understood that staying at Consolidated meant accepting a ceiling I would never be allowed to break through. "I see," I said, gathering my documents. "Then I suppose we have nothing further to discuss." Patterson seemed surprised by my calm response. He'd probably expected tears, pleas, or emotional outbursts, the kind of reactions that would confirm his beliefs about women's unsuitability for leadership. That afternoon, I submitted my resignation, effective in 2 weeks. The letter was brief and professional, citing pursuing other opportunities as my reason for leaving. I didn't mention the patent application, the business plan I'd been developing, or the fact that I was about to become their competition. The 2 weeks that followed were among the most liberating of my life. I watched Patterson and his supervisors scramble to maintain productivity without the innovations I'd been quietly implementing. Efficiency at Station 15 dropped by 25% within days. Quality control rejections increased across multiple assembly lines. Eddie Kowalski pulled me aside during my final night shift. "You know they're going to regret this," he said. "Half the improvements, keeping this place running, are your ideas." "That's their problem now," I replied, feeling lighter than I had in months. On my last day, I cleaned out my locker and took one final look at the factory floor, where I'd learned so much about business, innovation, and my own capabilities. The rejection letter from Patterson was tucked into my purse, not as a reminder of failure, but as evidence of the moment I'd decided to stop asking for permission and start taking control of my own destiny. The garage behind my small apartment building had been used for storage since the war began. Old furniture, unused appliances, and miscellaneous items that tenants couldn't bear to throw away. In May 1946, I convinced my landlord, Mr. Kowalski, Eddie's father, as it turned out, to let me clean it out and use it as a workshop in exchange for reduced rent. "What exactly are you planning to do in there?" he asked as we surveyed the cluttered space filled with dust-covered relics. "Manufacturing," I replied simply. "Small precision components for local businesses." Mr. Kowalski, a practical man who appreciated tenants who paid their rent on time and didn't cause trouble, agreed to the arrangement. Within a week, I had transformed the 20 by 24-foot space into a functional workshop. I purchased used equipment from factory liquidations, a small lathe, precision measuring tools, workbenches, and basic hand tools. My savings from 3 years of factory work, combined with Thomas's modest life insurance payout, gave me just enough capital to get started. The first piece of equipment I installed was a modified assembly jig based on my patented INS process. Patent number 2,847,391 had been approved in March, giving me exclusive rights to the manufacturing method that Consolidated was still struggling to implement efficiently. Every component I produced using this process would be superior to anything my former employer could manufacture. My first business license arrived on a humid Tuesday in June. The official document read, "Rose Manufacturing Solutions, Proprietor, M. Rose," deliberately ambiguous about the gender of the owner. I'd learned from my factory experience that many businesses might be hesitant to work with a woman-owned company. Regardless of the quality of the work, finding clients proved easier than I'd anticipated. The post-war economy was booming, and small manufacturers were struggling to meet demand with outdated equipment and inexperienced workers. I started by contacting machine shops and small parts suppliers, offering to handle their most challenging precision work, the components that were too complex for their standard equipment, but too small quantity for larger manufacturers too. My first contract came from Precision Parts Supply, a small company that made specialized components for printing presses. Their owner, Frank DeLuca, was skeptical when I showed up at his shop instead of the M. Rose he'd been expecting. "You're the manufacturing specialist?" he asked, looking confused. "I am," I replied confidently, laying out samples of my work on his desk. These components were manufactured using a patented process that increases precision while reducing production time by 40%. Frank examined the samples with an experienced eye, testing the tolerances with precision gauges. His expression changed from skepticism to genuine interest. "This is exceptional work. How fast can you produce them?" "Faster than anyone else you'll find," I assured him, "and at a better price point because my overhead is lower." That first order was for 500 specialized gear assemblies, needed within 2 weeks. Working 16-hour days in my garage workshop, I completed the order in 10 days. Every component passed Frank's rigorous quality inspection, and several exceeded his specifications. "I don't know how you're doing this," Frank said when he picked up the completed order, "but I want to discuss a longer-term arrangement." Word spread quickly through Chicago's network of small manufacturers. The woman in the garage who could produce impossible components on impossible deadlines became something of a legend. By September, I had steady contracts with 6 different companies and a waiting list of potential clients. The breakthrough that transformed my garage operation into a real business came in October. Midwest Automotive, a supplier for Ford's Chicago assembly plant, contacted me about a rush order for transmission components. Their regular supplier had failed to deliver, leaving them facing production delays that could cost thousands of dollars per day. "We need 2,000 units, and we need them in 5 days. Their procurement manager told me over the phone. "Can you handle this?" It was the largest order I'd ever been offered, worth more than my previous 6 months of income combined. It was also impossible to complete alone in 5 days, even working around the clock. But instead of declining, I saw an opportunity to test my next business expansion theory. I contacted Sarah Martinez and 3 other women from my former factory shift, offering them employment at wages 30% higher than Consolidated was paying. Within 24 hours, I had a skilled team working in my garage, implementing my patented assembly process on a larger scale. We completed the Midwest Automotive order in 4.5 days. Every component was perfect, and the delivery was early. More importantly, I'd proven that my business model could scale beyond a one-person operation. The business license hanging in my garage workshop represented more than legal permission to operate. It was my declaration of independence from a system that would never truly value my contributions. Rose. Manufacturing Solutions was no longer just an idea or a hope. It was a functioning business, built on innovation, quality, and the determination to prove that excellence speaks louder than prejudice. By spring of 1947, my garage workshop had become impossibly cramped. What started as a one-woman operation now employed 8 people working in shifts to meet demand. I was turning away orders weekly, not because we lacked skill, but because we lacked space. The decision to expand was no longer optional. It was essential for survival. I'd been reinvesting every dollar of profit back into the business, purchasing better equipment, higher quality materials, and building a cash reserve for exactly this moment. The garage operation had generated nearly $45,000 in revenue during its first year. With profit margins that made traditional manufacturers envious, my inside-out assembly process gave us such significant efficiency advantages that we could underbid competitors while maintaining higher profit percentages. The warehouse I found was in an industrial district on Chicago's South Side, 8 square feet of open space with high ceilings, loading docks, and room for expansion. The rent was $300 per month, which seemed enormous compared to my garage arrangement, but the space could accommodate 10 times our current production capacity. What made this move particularly significant was the timing. The Korean conflict was escalating, and military contractors were desperately seeking reliable suppliers for precision components. I'd maintained contacts from my consolidated days who were now working for defense contractors, and they'd begun quietly directing orders my way. The first major government contract came through Eddie Kowalski, who had left Consolidated to work for Raytheon's Chicago office. The military needed specialized radar components, manufactured to extremely tight tolerances, work that most companies couldn't handle reliably. They're offering $180,000 for the initial order, Eddie explained during our meeting at a small diner near the warehouse. But Margaret, this isn't just about the money. If you can deliver on this contract, you'll be positioned for much larger opportunities. The military is building a list of preferred suppliers for the next decade. The contract specifications were challenging even by my standards. The components required precision tolerances of less than 1/1000th of an inch, materials that could withstand extreme temperatures, and assembly processes that left no room for error. Failure rates above 0.5% would result in contract termination. I accepted the contract and immediately began the most ambitious expansion of my business to date. I hired 12 additional workers, all women with factory experience who had been struggling to find employment as post-war job priorities shifted back to male workers. I invested in precision grinding equipment, specialized measuring instruments, and climate-controlled assembly areas. The military contract took 6 months to complete, working around the clock in 3 shifts. Every component was tested multiple times before shipping. Our failure rate was 0.12%, less than 1/4 of the military's acceptable threshold. The contract officer who inspected our final delivery seemed stunned by the quality. "Mrs. Rose," he said, examining components under magnification, "this is the finest precision work we've received from any supplier, large or small. How are you achieving these tolerances?" "Proprietary assembly processes and rigorous quality control," I replied, not mentioning the patented methods that gave us our competitive advantage. That military contract led to 3 more government orders by the end of 1949, totaling over $600,000 in revenue. More importantly, it established Rose Manufacturing Solutions as a preferred supplier for precision military components, a designation that came with steady work and premium pricing. But the real breakthrough came in 1954, when I had the opportunity to purchase the entire building that housed our warehouse operation. The owner, facing financial difficulties, offered to sell for $85,000, less than 2 years of our current rent payments. I had the cash reserves to buy it outright, but instead I chose to leverage the purchase, taking a commercial loan for $60,000 and paying $25,000 in cash. The factory purchase agreement, signed on November 15, 1954, represented more than just a real estate transaction. It was my transformation from tenant to property owner, from small business operator to legitimate manufacturer. The building itself became a symbol of permanence and growth, visible proof that Rose Manufacturing Solutions was built to last. With ownership of our facility, I began the next phase of expansion. I installed specialized production lines for different types of components, created dedicated research and development space, and established quality control laboratories that rivaled those of companies 10 times our size. By 1955, we employed 43 people and were producing components for automotive, aerospace, military, and precision instrument manufacturers across the Midwest. That the business was generating over $1.2 million in annual revenue, with profit margins that allowed me to reinvest heavily in equipment and expansion while building substantial cash reserves. But perhaps more importantly, I was developing a reputation in manufacturing circles as someone who could solve impossible problems and deliver exceptional results under pressure. The purchase agreement for that factory building now hangs in my basement office, representing the moment when Rose Manufacturing Solutions evolved from a promising startup into a serious industrial operation. It was also the foundation for everything that would follow: the acquisitions, the expansions, the international operations that would eventually build the $47 million empire from the ashes of personal tragedy and professional discrimination. The 1960s brought opportunities I had never imagined possible when I started in that cramped garage. Rose Manufacturing Solutions had grown into a respected name in precision manufacturing. But what the business world didn't know was that I had been quietly building something much larger, a network of companies, investments, and properties that operated under different names and corporate structures. The decision to maintain multiple business identities wasn't born from deception, but from strategy. I had learned early that being known as a successful businesswoman brought unwanted attention from competitors seeking to undercut my operations, from family members suddenly interested in my financial situation, and from a society that still viewed wealthy women with suspicion and scrutiny. My public persona remained that of Margaret Rose, owner of a small but successful manufacturing company. I drove a modest sedan, lived in the same small house on Maple Street, and maintained the appearance of comfortable but unremarkable middle-class success. Meanwhile, my private portfolio was expanding exponentially through carefully planned acquisitions and international ventures. The Swiss bank account I established in 1960 became the cornerstone of my wealth preservation strategy. The account, opened during a supposed vacation to Europe, allowed me to move profits offshore where they could grow without attracting domestic attention. The bank statement from December 1960 showed an initial deposit of $485,000, money that represented years of reinvested profits from Rose Manufacturing Solutions. Switzerland's banking privacy laws protected my growing wealth from prying eyes, but more importantly, they allowed me to invest in European manufacturing companies that were rebuilding after the war. I acquired stakes in precision engineering firms in Germany, textile manufacturers in Belgium, and electronics companies in the Netherlands. Each investment was made through shell corporations that couldn't be traced back to the poor widow living on Maple Street. The genius of this strategy became apparent as these European investments flourished during the continent's economic recovery. The German engineering firm I partially acquired in 1962 for $200,000 was worth over $2 million by 1968. The Belgian textile operation returned 400% on my initial investment when European fashion exports boomed in the pit-1960s. But my most successful venture was the acquisition of struggling manufacturing companies in the American Midwest. While maintaining my modest public profile, I was secretly purchasing factories that were failing due to poor management or outdated processes. I would implement my patented efficiency improvements, install competent management, and transform these operations into profitable enterprises within 2 to 3 years. The beauty of this approach was its invisibility. To outside observers, I remained Margaret Rose, the widow who ran a small Chicago manufacturing company. The fact that I also owned Superior Components in Detroit, Precision Assembly Solutions in Milwaukee, and Industrial Manufacturing Services in Cleveland was known only to my lawyers and accountants, all of whom were bound by strict confidentiality agreements. Each acquisition followed the same pattern. I would identify a failing company with good equipment and strategic location but poor management. Using offshore financing that couldn't be traced to me, I would purchase the company through a holding corporation. Within months, I would implement the manufacturing processes that had made Rose Manufacturing Solutions so successful, often increasing productivity by 30 to 50% while reducing waste and improving quality. By 1965, this network of companies was generating combined revenues of over $8 million annually. The profits were systematically moved through a complex structure of holding companies and offshore accounts, ensuring that Margaret Rose's modest lifestyle never attracted suspicion. I maintained separate accounting systems, different banking relationships, and even used different lawyers for each major acquisition. The Swiss bank statement from 1965 showed account balances exceeding $3.2 million, wealth that would have made me one of the richest women in Chicago if anyone had known about it. But knowledge was power, and secrecy was protection. I had seen too many wealthy people become targets for relatives, con artists, and social climbers who viewed money as something to be extracted rather than earned. My own family, during their occasional visits, would sometimes comment on my stubborn refusal to improve my living situation. "Mom, you could afford a nicer house," my daughter Susan would say during holiday dinners. "You don't have to live like you're still struggling." I would smile and deflect these conversations, explaining that I was comfortable and didn't need more space or luxury. What I didn't tell them was that I owned 17 properties across the Midwest, held controlling interests in 12 different manufacturing companies, and maintained investment portfolios in 4 different countries. Offshore banking statement that documented this growing empire represented more than just accumulated wealth. It was proof of my ability to operate successfully in a business world that still questioned women's capabilities while simultaneously building the financial independence that would allow me to reveal the truth on my own terms when I chose to do so. The irony of my family's assumptions about my financial situation became most apparent during the major milestones in my children's and grandchildren's lives. While they worried about my supposed poverty, I was secretly ensuring their most important needs were met through carefully orchestrated anonymous donations and fortunate coincidences. When my grandson Jake was applying to colleges in 2019, I watched my daughter Susan stress over tuition costs during family gatherings. "The good schools are just so expensive," she would say, wringing her hands. "Even with financial aid, we're looking at $40,000 a year. I don't know how we'll manage it." Jake, brilliant but naive at 17, had his heart set on Northwestern University's engineering program. The family held multiple discussions about whether they could afford it, with various relatives suggesting community college or state schools as more realistic options. I sat quietly through these conversations, watching my grandson's face fall as his dreams seemed to slip away due to financial constraints. What they didn't know was that I had already contacted Northwestern's financial aid office through my attorney, establishing an anonymous scholarship fund specifically for academically gifted students from working families. The Margaret Sullivan Memorial Scholarship, named for my maiden name to avoid detection, would cover Jake's full tuition, room, and board for 4 years. The day Jake received his acceptance letter, along with the surprise full scholarship notification, the family celebrated as if they'd won the lottery. "Can you believe this luck?" Susan exclaimed, tears of relief in her eyes. "An anonymous donor created this scholarship specifically for students like Jake." I smiled and congratulated them while inwardly feeling both satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that I could provide for my family's needs. Sadness that they had never considered that their poor grandmother might be the source of their good fortune. The tuition receipt I kept from Jake's first semester payment tells the real story. While the family saw a generous anonymous scholarship, the document shows the true source, a wire transfer from Rose Educational Trust, one of the charitable foundations I had established years earlier. The amount $52,847.50 for tuition, room, board, and fees represented less than what my investments earned in a typical day. But to my family, it was life-changing. Emma's wedding planning in 2021 followed a similar pattern when she got engaged to David, a kind young man who worked as a graphic designer. The family immediately began discussing budget constraints. "We want to give her a beautiful wedding," my son Michael told me during one of our monthly dinners, "but weddings cost so much these days. We're thinking maybe a small ceremony, reception at the church hall." Emma, ever practical, insisted she was fine with a modest celebration, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes when she looked at wedding venues and realized most were beyond the family's budget. The venue she really wanted, a historic mansion with gardens overlooking Lake Michigan, cost $15,000 just for the rental. Once again, I intervened anonymously. Through a different attorney, I contacted the venue and arranged to sponsor a wedding for a deserving young couple. The venue manager was told that a wealthy philanthropist wanted to provide a dream wedding for someone who embodied kindness and dedication to family, qualities that certainly described Emma. When the venue called Emma to tell her she had been selected for their annual charitable wedding sponsorship, the family was stunned. "I can't believe someone would do this for a complete stranger," Emma said, crying with joy. "This is like a fairy tale." I attended that wedding, watching Emma dance in her beautiful gown in the elegant ballroom, knowing that I had given her the wedding of her dreams while remaining invisible in my role as benefactor. The wedding photos show a radiant bride surrounded by family, including her grandmother sitting modestly at a corner table, wearing a simple dress from JCPenney, and appearing to be exactly what everyone believed, an elderly woman of limited means enjoying her granddaughter's good fortune. But the receipts tell a different story. The final wedding bill, $47,892.18 for venue, catering, flowers, photography, and music, was paid through the Margaret Rose Foundation for Family Excellence, another of my charitable entities. The money came from dividends on my Microsoft stock purchases from the 1980s. Investments that had grown to be worth millions. These moments of secret generosity filled me with complex emotions. Pride in being able to provide for my family's dreams, frustration at their assumptions about my limitations, and growing sadness about the emotional distance these financial deceptions created. My family celebrated their good fortune while pitying their poor grandmother, never imagining that their greatest benefactor was sitting right beside them, invisible in plain sight. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in March 2025. When I inadvertently overheard a conversation that shattered any remaining illusions I had about my family's perception of me. I had arrived early for what was supposed to be my monthly dinner with Michael's family, letting myself in through the back door, as I always did. Voices from the living room stopped me in the kitchen doorway. "We need to start thinking practically about Grandma's situation," Susan was saying to Michael and their spouses. "She's 94, and we can't ignore the inevitable much longer." "The house might be worth something," Michael replied. "It's small, but the neighborhood has been improving. Maybe $150,000 if we're lucky." "That's being optimistic," Susan's husband, Tom, interjected. "The place needs a new roof, updated electrical, probably new plumbing. After repairs and real estate fees, we might net $100,000 if we're lucky." I stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to my children discuss my death and their inheritance with the casual tone usually reserved for planning grocery lists. "The bigger issue is her care," Susan continued. "She's still independent now, but what happens when she isn't? Nursing homes cost $5,000 a month or more. Her Social Security and whatever small savings she has won't cover it. Maybe we should start looking into Medicaid options," Michael suggested. "If she has to spend down her assets anyway. What assets?" Tom laughed bitterly. "She drives a 15-year-old Honda and clips coupons for groceries. Face it, when the time comes, we're going to be financially responsible for her care." My grandson Jake's voice joined the conversation. "I feel bad saying this, but I was hoping there might be something left for college loans. Emma and I both have so much debt, and with Grandma living so modestly all these years, I thought maybe she'd saved something." "Jake, honey," Susan said gently, "your grandmother has been living paycheck to paycheck for decades. She offered to help with your tuition, remember? If she had real money, don't you think she would have helped more substantially?" Emma's voice was softer, more sympathetic. "I just feel sorry for her. She's worked so hard her whole life, and she has so little to show for it. That tiny house, no travel, no nice things. It seems so unfair." "It is unfair," Michael agreed, "but that's the reality of her generation. Women didn't have the same opportunities. She did her best with what she had." The conversation continued, but I had heard enough. I quietly slipped out the back door and sat in my car for 20 minutes, processing what I had just learned. My family wasn't just unaware of my wealth, they had developed an entire narrative about my poverty that included pity, financial planning for my care, and disappointment about their eventual inheritance. Later that evening, I returned to the house and endured dinner. making small talk while watching my family with completely different eyes. When Jake mentioned needing to find a summer job to help with expenses, I offered to ask around for opportunities. When Emma talked about David's student loans, I suggested she look into assistance programs. Each time, I saw the patient, slightly condescending smiles of people humoring their well-meaning but financially irrelevant grandmother. The next morning, I went down to my basement office and retrieved my phone. Scrolling through the family group text conversation I had been accidentally added 2 months earlier, the messages were a stark record of their assumptions about my financial situation and their plans for managing my eventual decline. Susan had written, "Spoke with elder care attorney today. If mom needs nursing home care, we'll need to apply for Medicaid. Her assets are minimal enough that qualification shouldn't be difficult." Michael's response, "Good thinking," also looked into reverse mortgage options for her house, but given its condition and value, probably not worth it. Jake had added, "Feels weird planning for this stuff, but better to be prepared. At least we know there won't be complicated estate issues." Emma's message was the most painful. "I just wish she could have enjoyed more of her life instead of always worrying about money. She's worked so hard and has so little to show for it." The screenshot of these messages, saved to my phone, became a devastating artifact of my family's complete misunderstanding of my life and circumstances. Here was documented evidence that they viewed me not just as poor, but as a future financial burden they would need to manage with government assistance and careful planning. That evening, I made the decision that would change everything. I called my attorney and asked him to arrange a family meeting for the following week. It was time to stop being their poor, struggling grandmother and start being Margaret Rose, the businesswoman who had built an empire they couldn't imagine. Inheritance they were planning to manage so carefully was about to become the biggest surprise of their lives. After making the decision to reveal my secret, I spent the weekend in my basement office, surrounded by the evidence of a lifetime of strategic business building that my family had never suspected existed. The modest house above concealed what was essentially a corporate headquarters, complete with filing systems, financial records, and business documentation spanning nearly 8 decades. The basement had been my sanctuary for decades, the one place where I could drop the facade of the struggling widow and be Margaret Rose, CEO and majority shareholder of a business empire worth $47 million. The walls were lined with framed patents, business awards, photographs with presidents and industry leaders, and certificates of incorporation for dozens of companies and subsidiaries. At the center of it all was my desk, a beautiful mahogany piece I had purchased from the estate of a railroad magnate in 1968. On its surface lay the business portfolio I had been maintaining for my attorney, a comprehensive documentation of every company I owned, every investment I held, and every asset I had accumulated over the years. The portfolio itself was a work of art, bound in leather with gold lettering that read Rose Holdings, complete asset documentation. Inside were detailed reports on each of my major business interests, current valuations, profit and loss statements, and growth projections. It was the kind of professional documentation that Fortune 500 companies maintained for their shareholders, which in this case was essentially just me. The first section documented Rose Manufacturing Solutions and its subsidiaries, showing how my original garage workshop had evolved into a network of precision manufacturing companies across the Midwest. The current valuation, $18.7 million. Generating annual revenues of $3.2 million, with profit margins that continued to exceed industry standards. The second section detailed my international holdings, the European companies I had acquired or invested in during the 1960s and 1970s. What had started as strategic investments during post-war reconstruction had grown into significant ownership stakes in manufacturing, technology, and real estate ventures across 6 countries. Current value, $12.4 million. The third section was perhaps the most impressive, my investment portfolio. Decades of reinvesting profits into carefully selected stocks, bonds, real estate, and emerging technologies had created a diversified portfolio that weathered every economic downturn while consistently growing. Early investments in companies like IBM, Microsoft, and Apple had multiplied exponentially. Current value, $15.90 million. As I reviewed each section, I was struck by how completely I had succeeded in my original goal of building something lasting. In Thomas's memory, What had started as a war widow's determination to never be dependent on others had grown into a business empire that could support dozens of families for generations. But the documentation also told another story, one of calculated secrecy and emotional isolation. Every major business decision had been made alone. Every success celebrated privately. Every milestone achieved without the knowledge or support of the family I was building it for. I had become wealthy beyond my original dreams while remaining emotionally impoverished, cut off from authentic relationships by the very secrecy that protected my financial independence. The photographs on my office walls showed the double life I had been living. There was Margaret Rose accepting a Manufacturing Excellence Award from the Governor of Illinois in 1982. Margaret Rose shaking hands with the president of Ford Motor Company after signing a major supply contract in 1987. Margaret Rose being inducted into the Chicago Business Hall of Fame in 1995. In every photo, I was dressed professionally, confident, successful, nothing like the modest grandmother my family knew. The contrast with my upstairs persona was jarring. Down here, I was surrounded by evidence of exceptional achievement and business acumen. Upstairs, I maintained the careful illusion of an elderly woman of modest means, clipping coupons and worrying about utility bills. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's recent conversations about my financial limitations had taken place directly above this room, where documentation of my actual wealth was meticulously organized and regularly updated. They had been planning for my poverty while sitting 20 feet above proof of my prosperity. I opened the portfolio to the executive summary page, a single sheet that laid out my total net worth as of March 2025, $47,124. $893.47. The number represented more than money. It represented decades of innovation, strategic thinking, calculated risks, and relentless determination to prove that a war widow could build something extraordinary. Tomorrow, this portfolio would transform my family's understanding of who I had been all these years. The grandmother they pitied for her modest circumstances would become Margaret Rose, the self-made millionaire who had been supporting their dreams while hiding her own success. As I prepared to close the portfolio and head upstairs to my simple bedroom, I realized that this revelation would change more than just their perception of my wealth. It would force all of us to confront the relationships we had built on false assumptions and the emotional distance that financial secrecy had created. Monday morning arrived with unusual clarity of purpose. I had spent 70 years building a business empire in secret. And now I was about to dismantle the carefully constructed fiction that had protected and isolated me for so long. The decision felt both liberating and terrifying. My first call was to Robert Chen, the attorney who had been managing my complex business affairs for the past 15 years. Robert was one of only 3 people who knew the full extent of my wealth, and he had been urging me for years to consider sharing the truth with my family. "Margaret, are you certain about this?" he asked when I explained my decision. "Once you reveal your wealth, you can't go back to anonymity. Your family dynamics will change permanently." "Robert, they're already planning my funeral and dividing up my imaginary poverty," I replied. "The family dynamics are based on a lie. It's time for some honesty." "Understood. How do you want to structure the revelation? Gradual disclosure or full transparency?" "Full transparency. I want them to understand exactly who I've been all these years." Robert agreed to help arrange what he diplomatically called a family estate planning meeting. The letter he sent to my children and grandchildren was formal but deliberately vague, mentioning the need to discuss important family financial matters and requesting everyone's attendance the following Sunday at 2 p.m. I spent the week preparing for the meeting with the same methodical approach I had used for major business presentations throughout my career. This wasn't just a family conversation, it was the most important presentation of my life, one that would determine the future of my relationships with the people I loved most. The handwritten speech notes I prepared became my roadmap for the revelation. Unlike my usual business presentations, which relied heavily on charts and financial projections, this speech needed to balance facts with emotions, explanations with apologies, and revelations with reassurances. The opening was crucial. "For 78 years, I have allowed you to believe that I am a poor widow who has struggled financially since your grandfather's death. This was a deliberate choice, and I owe you an explanation." The middle section would reveal the basic facts. The business empire the secret investments, the anonymous support I had provided over the years, but more importantly, it would explain my reasoning, the protection that secrecy provided, the independence it ensured, and the security it created. The conclusion needed to address the future, my intentions for my wealth, my hopes for our relationships going forward, and my need for them to understand that I was still the same person they had always known, just with different financial circumstances. That as I refined the speech, I realized I was also grappling with my own emotions about the revelation. Part of me was excited to finally share my accomplishments with my family, to show them that their grandmother was more than they had ever imagined. But another part was apprehensive about how this knowledge would change our relationships. Would they still see me as their loving grandmother? Or would they view me differently once they knew about my wealth? Would they be proud of my achievements, or would they be angry about the deception? Would they understand my reasons for secrecy, or would they feel betrayed by years of carefully maintained lies? I also had to prepare for practical questions about the future. My children and grandchildren would naturally want to know about inheritance, about how this wealth would affect their own lives, about whether I planned to change my modest lifestyle now that the secret was out. The speech notes included sections addressing these concerns. I planned to explain that while I intended to be more generous in my support of their goals and dreams, I had no intention of fundamentally changing how I lived. The modest house on Maple Street would remain my home, not because I couldn't afford better, but because it had become part of who I was. I also prepared supporting documentation for the meeting, simplified financial summaries, photographs from my business career, and examples of the anonymous support I had provided over the years. The goal wasn't to overwhelm them with details, but to provide enough evidence that they would understand the scope and legitimacy of what I had built. Most challenging part of my preparation was anticipating their reactions. Jake might be embarrassed about his comments regarding my supposed poverty. Emma might feel guilty about accepting anonymous wedding funding. Susan and Michael might be hurt that I hadn't trusted them with the truth earlier. But there was also the possibility that they would be proud, amazed, and excited to finally know who their grandmother really was. Perhaps the revelation would bring us closer together rather than driving us apart. As Sunday approached, I felt the same mixture of anticipation and nervousness that had accompanied every major business decision throughout my career. The difference was that this time, the stakes weren't financial, they were deeply personal. Sunday afternoon arrived with the crisp clarity of early spring. I had rented a private meeting room at the Marriott downtown Neutral Territory that would allow for serious conversation without the casual distractions of someone's home. The rental receipt, tucked into my purse, showed a charge of $180 for 4 hours, but to me it represented the cost of finally buying honesty with my family. I arrived 30 minutes early to arrange the room exactly as I wanted it. A conference table with seating for 8, my business portfolio positioned at the head, and a projector setup that I wouldn't need but that added to the formal atmosphere I was trying to create. This needed to feel like the important business meeting it essentially was. My family arrived together, having clearly coordinated their transportation, probably discussing their concerns about this mysterious estate planning meeting during the drive. Susan entered first, followed by Michael, then their spouses, and finally Jake and Emma. Their expressions ranged from curious to mildly concerned, but no one seemed to suspect they were about to have their understanding of reality completely overturned. "Mom, this is very formal," Susan observed, taking in the conference room setting. "Are you feeling all right? You're not sick, are you?" "I'm fine, dear. Please, everyone take a seat." Jake settled into a chair across from me with the slightly patronizing patience of a young man indulging his elderly grandmother's eccentricities. "Grandma, if this is about your will or anything like that, you know we just want you to be comfortable. We're not worried about inheritance." "That's exactly what we need to discuss," I replied, opening my portfolio. "But first, I need to tell you something that I should have shared years ago." Emma leaned forward with concern. "Grandma, you're scaring us a little. Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine. Better than fine, actually. But I need you to understand that for the past 78 years, I have been living a lie." The room fell silent. Michael and Susan exchanged worried glances, probably wondering if I was about to reveal some devastating family secret or confession of wrongdoing. "I have allowed you to believe that I am a poor widow who has struggled financially since your grandfather died in the war. I have accepted your pity, your concern about my modest lifestyle, and your plans to care for me as a financial burden. All of this has been based on a deliberate deception. Mom, what are you talking about? Michael asked, his voice gentle but confused. I'm talking about this, I said, placing the first page of my financial summary on the table. My current net worth is $47,124,893.47. The silence that followed was profound, not the comfortable quiet of a family gathering, but the stunned silence of people trying to process information that doesn't fit their reality. Tom was the first to speak. I'm sorry, did you say million? I did. Jake laughed nervously. Grandma, that's not possible. You live in that tiny house, you drive an old car, you clip coupons, all by choice, Jake, all part of maintaining a fiction that protected me and my business interests for decades. Susan was staring at the financial document as if it might disappear if she looked away. This has to be some kind of mistake. Mom, where would this money come from? From the business empire I built after your father died. From investments I made when you thought I was struggling to pay rent. From decades of work that I kept secret because I learned early that wealth makes you a target. I began laying out additional documents, business registrations, investment statements, property deeds, patent certificates. Each piece of paper was another crack in the facade I had maintained for so long. Emma was the first to really grasp the implications. The scholarship Jake received, the wedding sponsorship I got, was that you, yes, the anonymous donations that always seemed to come when our family needed help most. Yes, Michael was shaking his head slowly. Mom, I don't understand. Why live like you were poor when you had all this? Because the moment people know you have money, everything changes. Every relationship becomes suspect. Every request for help becomes a demand. Every family gathering becomes an evaluation of what you might be willing to share. The room erupted in a mixture of questions, exclamations, and attempts to process this revelation. Jake was looking at his phone, probably trying to verify that Northwestern's Margaret Sullivan Memorial Scholarship actually existed. Emma was crying, whether from shock, relief, or confusion, I couldn't tell. Through it all, I sat calmly at the head of the table, watching my family grapple with the fact that their poor, struggling grandmother had been one of Chicago's most successful business owners for the better part of a century. The moment of complete revelation came when I placed the current net worth statement in the center of the table. An official document from Goldman Sachs, Private Wealth Management, showing my total assets as of March 31, 2025. The letterhead alone commanded respect. But the number at the bottom of the page commanded stunned silence. This is impossible, Susan whispered, her voice barely audible. Mom, people don't just secretly accumulate $47 million. Where did this come from? I opened my portfolio to the section documenting Rose Manufacturing Solutions and its evolution from garage startup to industrial empire. It started in 1946, when I was 22 years old and refused to accept that being a war widow meant accepting limitations. I walked them through the timeline methodically, like the business presentation it essentially was. The original patent that launched everything. The garage workshop that became a factory. The military contracts that established credibility. The strategic acquisitions that built a network of companies across multiple states. You own Precision Assembly Solutions in Milwaukee, Michael asked, recognizing the name. I've done consulting work for them. They're a major manufacturer. I've owned them since 1963. They were failing when I acquired them. Implementing my manufacturing processes turned them into one of the most profitable precision parts suppliers in the Midwest. Jake was frantically taking notes, trying to keep track of the revelations. Grandma, you're telling us you've been running a multi-million-dollar business empire while we thought you could barely afford groceries. Multiple business empires, I corrected. Manufacturing, real estate, international investments, technology holdings. I haven't just been running them, I built them from nothing. Emma was still processing the personal implications. My wedding, Jake's scholarship, the times our family mysteriously received help when we needed it most. How much of our lives have you been secretly controlling? Not controlling, I said firmly. Supporting. There's a difference. I showed them the documentation of anonymous donations, scholarship funds, and charitable sponsorships I had established over the years. Every major expense they had worried about, every financial crisis they had navigated, every opportunity they had received, I had been there, invisible but present, ensuring they had what they needed to succeed. The Margaret Sullivan Memorial Scholarship, Jake said, reading from his phone. One researched this when I received it. It was established by an anonymous donor to honor a working woman who died young. That was your mother, wasn't it? Your great-grandmother. She died when I was 16, working in a factory for wages that barely kept us fed. The scholarship honors her memory and helps students who might otherwise be limited by their circumstances. Tom, who had been quiet through most of the revelation, finally spoke. Margaret, this is incredible, but I have to ask, if you've had this kind of wealth for decades, why maintain the charade? Why let us worry about your financial security? It was the question I had been dreading and preparing for simultaneously. Because wealth changes everything, Tom. Every relationship, every interaction, every assumption people make about your motivations. I watched what happened to other wealthy people, family members who suddenly became very attentive, friends who disappeared or became calculating, children who lost their independence because they knew money would always be available. I pulled out photographs from my business career, images of me accepting awards, shaking hands with politicians and business leaders, speaking at conferences and industry events. This is who I've been while you thought I was clipping coupons and worrying about utility bills. Susan was staring at a photo of me receiving an Industry Lifetime Achievement Award in 1998. I remember this year, we had Thanksgiving dinner, and you said you'd spent the day at home reading, but you were actually in New York accepting this award. I was. I flew back the same evening to maintain the fiction. The revelation was becoming real for them in ways that went beyond the financial statements. Their grandmother wasn't just wealthy, she was accomplished, respected, influential in ways they had never imagined. The business world knows me as M. Rose or Margaret Rose, I continued. Industry publications have featured my companies, my innovations, my success story, but Margaret Rose, the businesswoman, and Margaret Rose, the grandmother, have lived completely separate lives. Emma was crying openly now. Grandma, we felt sorry for you. We talked about how unfair it was that you had worked so hard and had so little to show for it. Meanwhile, you were one of the most successful business owners in the region. You had nothing to feel sorry for, I assured her. I chose this life, this separation, this secrecy. It protected me, but it also protected you. You've all achieved your own successes without the complication of knowing you had a wealthy grandmother. Your accomplishments are your own. The net worth statement sat in the center of the table like a bomb that had exploded and reshaped everything around it. My family was no longer looking at their poor, struggling grandmother. They were seeing Margaret Rose, the self-made millionaire who had built an empire while hiding in plain sight. The immediate aftermath of my revelation was unlike anything I had experienced in 78 years of life. Within hours of our family meeting, everything changed, not just my relationships with my children and grandchildren, but their entire approach to our family dynamic. The phone calls started that same evening. Susan called first, her voice a mixture of awe and confusion. Mom, I've been thinking about everything you told us today. I need to apologize for so many things, for assuming you needed our help, for making decisions about your care without asking, for treating you like a burden we needed to manage. Michael's call came an hour later. I've been researching your companies online, he said. There are articles about you dating back to the 1960s, industry publications calling you a pioneer in manufacturing innovation. How did we not know any of this? But it was Jake's reaction that concerned me most. His text message arrived at 11 p.m. Grandma, I feel like an idiot. All those times I acted like you didn't understand money or business. You probably know more about finance than everyone I know combined. I'm embarrassed and amazed and confused all at the same time. The following week brought a parade of family visits, each person seemingly needing to process the revelation individually. Emma came on Tuesday, bringing photo albums and asking me to identify which family events I had attended while simultaneously managing major business deals. This photo from my high school graduation, she said, pointing to a picture of me sitting quietly in the audience. You look tired here. Were you coming from something important? I had just returned from Frankfurt, where I was finalizing the acquisition of a precision tooling company, I admitted. I flew back that morning to make sure I didn't miss your graduation. You flew to Germany for business and back for my graduation. And we never knew. That was the point, dear. I wanted to be present for your important moments without the complications that my business life would have created. But, along with the amazement and apologies, came a subtle shift in behavior that I had both anticipated and dreaded. Suddenly, my opinions carried more weight in family discussions. When we talked about Jake's career plans, everyone listened more carefully to my suggestions. When Emma mentioned financial concerns, family members looked to me expectantly, as if my wealth automatically made me responsible for solving every problem. The change was most apparent during our next family dinner. Instead of the casual gathering it had always been, conversation became more formal, more careful. Tom asked for my advice on his retirement investments. Susan wanted to discuss whether her son should pursue an expensive graduate program. Even simple decisions about where to eat dinner seemed to defer to my preferences in a way they never had before. This is exactly what I was afraid of, I told Robert Chen during our meeting the following week. They're not treating me like their grandmother anymore. They're treating me like their wealthy benefactor. Robert nodded knowingly. It's common in families when wealth is revealed. The relationships need time to recalibrate. They're processing not just the money, but the fact that their fundamental understanding of you was incorrect. The most difficult conversation came with my revised will draft. I had always intended to leave my wealth to my family, but the revelation of my assets required updating my estate planning to reflect both my actual net worth and my new understanding of my family's character. The original will, written when they believed I was poor, had been simple. The house to Michael, modest savings, to be divided among the grandchildren, personal items distributed according to their preferences. Now, with $47 million in assets to distribute, the decisions were infinitely more complex. That I spent hours with Robert, discussing not just who should inherit what amounts, but how to structure the inheritance, to encourage rather than enable, to support their dreams without removing their motivation to achieve their own success. I want to establish conditions, I told him, not punitive ones, but requirements that ensure they understand the responsibility that comes with wealth. Educational achievements, charitable commitments, perhaps requirements to work in the family businesses for a period to understand how this money was earned. The revised will draft reflected my new priorities. Significant amounts for each family member, but structured as trusts that would provide support while encouraging continued personal growth. Scholarships and charitable foundations to ensure the wealth would benefit others beyond our family. Provisions for maintaining the businesses that had created this prosperity. But perhaps most importantly, I included requirements for annual family meetings where we would discuss not just financial matters, but family values, relationships, and our collective responsibility to use this wealth meaningfully. The artifact that captured this transformation was the revised will itself, a document that evolved from a simple distribution of modest assets to a complex structure for managing generational wealth and family relationships. It represented both the culmination of my business success and my hope that this revelation could ultimately strengthen, rather than complicate, the bonds between us. 3 months after the revelation, I made another decision that surprised my family. I established the Thomas Rose Foundation for Veteran Families, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting the spouses and children of service members killed in action. The foundation's charter, filed with the state of Illinois, represented more than just another business venture. It was my way of ensuring that Thomas's memory would live on through meaningful action. I want this foundation to help families like ours, I explained to my children during our first official family board meeting. Families where the surviving spouse has to rebuild everything from nothing, often while being underestimated or overlooked by society. The foundation would provide business loans for veteran spouses starting companies, scholarships for their children, and mentorship programs, connecting successful business owners with those just beginning their entrepreneurial journeys. The initial endowment was $5 million, a significant commitment that demonstrated this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. Jake had volunteered to help with the foundation's digital presence and marketing, bringing skills I had never developed. "Grandma, your story is exactly what this foundation represents," he said during one of our planning sessions. "You're living proof that being widowed by war doesn't mean accepting limitations, but perhaps more meaningful than the foundation itself was how working together on it began to rebuild our family relationships on more authentic terms, instead of the careful deference that had characterized our interactions since the revelation." We were collaborating as equals, each contributing our own expertise and perspectives. Emma brought her event planning experience to help design fundraising galas. Michael contributed his business consulting knowledge to help establish operational procedures. Susan used her nonprofit experience to navigate regulatory requirements. For the first time in decades, our family was working together toward a common goal that had nothing to do with managing my supposed poverty. The process also created opportunities for honest conversations about our past. During one foundation planning meeting, Emma finally asked the question that had been bothering her for months. "Grandma, I need to understand something. When you secretly paid for my wedding, when you funded Jake's scholarship, when you helped our family in all those anonymous ways, was that manipulation? Were you controlling our lives without us knowing it?" It was a fair question, one I had been expecting. "Emma, I've asked myself the same thing many times. The line between support and control can be very thin, especially when the support is provided secretly." I paused, considering my words carefully. "I think the difference was in my motivation. I never influenced your decisions. I simply removed financial barriers that might have prevented you from pursuing what you truly wanted. Your choice of David as a husband wasn't influenced by my ability to pay for an expensive wedding. Jake's choice of Northwestern wasn't influenced by knowing I could afford the tuition." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "It's like you were evening the playing field rather than tilting it in a particular direction." "That's exactly right. I wanted you to make choices based on your values and desires, not on financial limitations that I had the power to remove." The foundation work also revealed how much my family's perspective on wealth and responsibility had evolved since the revelation. Instead of viewing my money as an abstract inheritance to be eventually received, they were seeing it as a tool for creating positive change. Michael surprised me during one board meeting by suggesting we expand the foundation's scope. "Mom, what if we created mentorship programs specifically for women in manufacturing? You broke barriers in that industry that most people don't even realize existed. And scholarship programs for children of immigrants," Susan added, "people who face the same kind of systemic underestimation you experienced as a woman in the 1940s. These suggestions showed me that my family was beginning to understand wealth not as an entitlement, but as a responsibility. They were thinking about legacy, impact, and the obligation that comes with extraordinary resources. The charter document establishing the Thomas Rose Foundation became a symbol of our family's transformation. Unlike my business documents, which represented individual achievement built in secrecy, the foundation charter represented collective commitment to values larger than ourselves. The foundation also provided a structure for ongoing family involvement in managing our wealth. Regular board meetings gave us reasons to gather that went beyond social visits. Strategic planning sessions created opportunities for meaningful conversation about values, priorities, and our shared vision for the future. 6 months after the revelation, I realized that my family had stopped treating me differently because of my wealth. They had accepted that Margaret Rose, the grandmother, and Margaret Rose, the businesswoman, were the same person: complex, accomplished, loving, and human. The foundation work had given us a way to move forward together, building new traditions while honoring our family's history of resilience and determination. Most importantly, Thomas's memory was no longer just my private inspiration. Through the foundation, his sacrifice was becoming a source of hope and support for other families facing similar challenges. The empire I had built in his honor was now becoming a legacy we would all share. 1 year after the revelation, we gathered again in that same conference room at the Marriott, not for crisis management this time, but for celebration. The Thomas Rose Foundation had awarded its first scholarships, funded its first business loans, and supported 12 veteran families through major life transitions. More importantly, our family had found its way to authentic relationships built on truth rather than assumptions. The final family portrait we took that day tells the real story. Unlike the stilted, careful interactions that had characterized our relationships when they believed I was poor, this photograph shows genuine warmth, respect, and connection. Jake and Emma are sitting beside me with easy familiarity, no longer walking on eggshells around their struggling grandmother. Susan and Michael look relaxed and proud, finally seeing their mother as the accomplished woman she had always been. "You know what I realized," Emma said as we reviewed the foundation's first annual report together. "You didn't just build a business empire. you've built a masterclass in resilience, strategic thinking, and long-term planning. We were getting those lessons our whole lives without even knowing it." She was right, though I hadn't consciously intended it that way. Every family gathering where I had quietly observed and listened, every crisis where I had provided anonymous support, every achievement where I had celebrated their success without claiming credit, all of it had been teaching them about priorities, values, and the difference between having wealth and being defined by it. Jake had perhaps learned the most profound lesson. "Grandma, I spent years thinking success meant showing off what you'd achieved, but you showed me that real success means having the security to be yourself without needing external validation." The transformation in our family dynamics was evident in how we handled disagreements and decisions. Instead of the patronizing patience they had once shown their limited grandmother, they engaged with my opinions as those of an experienced business leader. Instead of the defensive deference I had seen after the initial revelation, they brought their own expertise and perspectives to our discussions as equals. Michael had taken the lead on expanding the Foundation's mentorship programs. "Mom, I've been thinking about your story, how you had to figure everything out alone, because there wasn't a support system for women entrepreneurs in the 1940s. What if we could be that support system for people facing similar barriers today?" It was during these conversations that I began to understand the deeper impact of my decades-long deception. While I had been protecting myself and my wealth through secrecy, I had also been depriving my family of the chance to know their full history, to understand their grandmother's true capabilities, and to benefit from the wisdom that comes with extraordinary challenges overcome. "I have regrets," I told them during one of our foundation planning meetings, "not about building the business or maintaining financial independence, but about the emotional distance that secrecy created. I robbed you of the chance to really know me, and I robbed myself of the chance to share my experiences and lessons with people who could have benefited from them." Susan reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom, you did what you thought was best with the information and circumstances you had. But now we know, and we can move forward together." The foundation had become more than a charitable organization. It was a vehicle for healing and growth that honored both our past struggles and our current opportunities. The scholarship recipients reminded me of my own determination as a young widow. The business loan recipients faced challenges similar to those I had navigated in my garage workshop. The mentorship program connected successful entrepreneurs with those just beginning their journeys, creating the support network I had never had. But perhaps the most important lesson emerged during a quiet moment with Jake, who had recently graduated and was considering his career options. "Grandma, how did you know when you were making the right decisions? You took so many risks, made so many choices that could have failed." "I didn't know," I admitted. "Most of the time, I was terrified, but I had learned that the greatest risk was accepting limitations that other people placed on me. Every major decision came down to choosing between security with constraints or uncertainty with possibility. And you always chose possibility. I chose autonomy. I chose the right to succeed or fail based on my own efforts rather than other people's assumptions about what I was capable of. As I reflect now on the journey from that first Sunday dinner confrontation to this moment of family unity and shared purpose, I see that the real fortune wasn't the $47 million I accumulated over 78 years. It was the strength to survive devastating loss, the courage to risk everything on my own vision, and the wisdom to eventually choose truth over protection. The final family portrait captures all of this, not just a wealthy grandmother with her grateful family, but a group of people who have learned to see each other clearly, respect each other's capabilities, and work together toward goals larger than themselves. We are no longer bound by assumptions about poverty and limitation, but by shared values, genuine affection, and collective commitment to using our resources meaningfully. Thomas would be proud, I think, not just of the empire built in his memory, but of the family that has emerged stronger and more authentic through the revealing of long-hidden truths.